Perhaps you've heard of the Pali Canon of Buddhism. Well, what is the Pali Canon? That's what I'm going to discuss on today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So the Pali Canon is, what is it? Well, in a nutshell, it's the most complete amount of evidence we have of what the Buddha actually might have taught and divulged to the world in terms of the Dharma, the Buddhist Dharma. At least the most complete in an Indic language, that is to say, in a language from India. Now, Pali is a language. It's a language related to Sanskrit. Sanskrit is an early Indian language, and Pali is basically a dialect of Sanskrit. Now, the word Pali has various meanings. It's quite complex where the word came from, but that's not really important for us now. What we need to understand is that Pali is essentially a language. And so the Pali Canon is, in a nutshell, the Buddhist canon that we find in the Pali language. Now, during the Buddha's lifetime, writing appears to have been unknown. It's not mentioned in the texts. Instead, what is mentioned in the texts is memorization. And so these discourses, all the material that we find in the Pali Canon, or at least the part that goes back the farthest, insofar as anything does, is going to go back to material that was memorized during the Buddha's lifetime. And we might wonder how it is that people can memorize enormous amounts of material and pass it on. In fact, in India at the time, there was a long tradition of doing just this. The Brahmins are a caste of people who were essentially a priestly caste, if you like. One of their duties, part of their Dharma, was to memorize and remember and retain the Vedas. The Vedas are a number of texts that went back even 1,000 years or more before the Buddha's own lifetime. And so these Vedic texts had been memorized and passed down by many generations of Brahmins before the time of the Buddha. There was a long history of this in India at the time, and the Buddha and the people who surrounded him, his Sangha, his disciples, were aware of this and made use of this kind of, shall we say, technology, if you like, to try to retain some memory of what the Buddha himself taught. Indeed, we see evidence of this in these early texts themselves, where we'll see some suttas where, in particular, Sariputta, who is the Buddha's disciple, who was foremost in wisdom, would lead the monastics, the monks, in chanting together some of these ideas from the Dharma, chanting together essentially enumerated lists of dharmic positions so that people could remember them. That is something that we find evidence of in the texts. Now, after the Buddha's lifetime, once he'd passed away, there are a number of significant developments that are related to the idea of the Pali Canon. Now, first of all, and perhaps most importantly, about a century or so after the Buddha's lifetime, there arose the kingdom, or the emperorship, the empire of Ashoka. Ashoka is a king, an early king in India, or emperor if you like, who unified most of what we consider India today under a single rulership. And his rulership was typified by Buddhism. In other words, he seems to have accepted Buddhism as his own practice. I did an earlier video on Emperor Ashoka, and I will put a link to that down in the show notes if you want to hear more about him. He's a fascinating character in many ways. But in any event, he seems to have not only accepted it himself, but tried to disseminate it widely. That was something the Buddha himself did, but Emperor Ashoka would, of course, have had much more power and capability to do this. And perhaps most famously for us, and most importantly for our story today, around the 3rd century BCE, before the Common Era, he sent a delegation, including his son Mahinda, who was a monastic, to the island of Sri Lanka to bring the Dharma there. to bring, again, what he would have done was to bring people who had memorized the Dharma, who had memorized the Pali Canon, or at least whatever existed of it back then. We don't exactly know how entirely it would have been the same or different. But in any event, whatever was existing at the time was brought to Sri Lanka and disseminated there. The Pali Canon was then written down for the first time, so far as we know, around the 1st century before the Common Era. And the exact reasons why it was written down are not entirely clear. The traditional story that comes down to us is that there was some kind of famine, and a number of the monastics were dying out, in particular monks who had memorized the canon, and so there was some concern about actually losing the whole thing, because if the last monastic who had memorized it had died, of course it would be totally gone. So there was a decision to write it down at that point. Although this is the traditional story, Stephen Collins has remarked that we don't really know exactly what was going on, because some of the earliest reports of this really don't clarify this. This seems to come from later material, so it could be any number of reasons why there was a decision to write things down. My own supposition, at least in part, is that this is a time of a lot of ferment, the 1st century before the Common Era. This is around the time of the earliest rising of the Mahayana ideals. And so there may have been some essentially dharmic conflict, different ideas around. And as a result, there was a decision to formalize things by writing them down so that we could be sure that they were preserved properly, or at least some people would have done that in order to preserve what they felt was the accurate text that need to be remembered. And scholar Alex Wynne believes that it was at that time, around the 1st century before the Common Era, that the canon was essentially closed, that the Pali Canon was largely, at least in the earliest parts, was closed. That is to say that once this material had been written down around this time, there really was nothing else that wanted to be added to it, or was able to be added to it, because it was sort of a closed canon. Now there's some scholarly disagreement about this, about exactly when the Pali Canon was closed, and we'll be discussing elements of it in a moment. But in any event, that's part of the early history. And now let's turn to what the canon is, what it is we find in it today. In a nutshell, the Pali Canon consists of 3 of what are called baskets. The Pali word is Pitakas. So we have the Sutta Pitaka, we have the Vinaya Pitaka, and we have the Abhidhamma Pitaka. Usually, actually, it's said the other direction. It's the Vinaya first, then the Suttas, then the Abhidhamma. That's generally the order that it's put in. These are 3 baskets of different kinds of material that we find in the canon, and each one is really importantly different from the others. I'll go through all 3 of them, but let me just say to begin with that in terms of age, most scholars put the Suttas as the earliest. The Suttas seem to go back the farthest, then the Vinaya, and then the Abhidhamma. Now, so that's generally the order that I'll describe them in now, beginning with what probably are, at least in the main, the earliest materials there, that is the Suttas. So what is the Sutta Pitaka to begin with? Well, the Suttas what we find are basically 5 collections of suttas, which are called Nikayas. These are essentially collected groups of suttas, which are discourses. In a nutshell, in a small way of describing them, discourses from the Buddha and the Buddha's disciples that we find in different books. And indeed, I have a collection of them behind me. Many of these, 4 of them, are going to be the main Nikayas. The middle length discourses is probably the most famous. That is to say, discourses that are middling in length. There are long discourses, and then there are 2 collections of different kinds of discourses organized in terms of number. That is to say, the discourses about things in 1s and 2s and 3s, and then another group that is organized in terms of different kinds of themes. And then there is a 5th basket, the Khuddaka Nikaya, which is a bunch of miscellaneous discourses. And in this miscellany, we find some of the most famous, such as the Dhammapada, We find some of the oldest, that is, sections of the Sutta Nipata, and we find a bunch of less old material, material that's really sort of commentarial, actually, that seems to have come from a later part, and seems to have been put into that this last collection, this last Pitaka, at the end of its closing, either around, depending on whether you agree with Alex Wynne, around the end of the first century before the Common Era, or after that. And what we should say about the suttas is that they are perhaps the main focus of most of our attention, because it's in the suttas that we really get the Dharma described. It's where we hear the Buddha's voice, insofar as we know anything about him, describing the Dharma, describing practice. It's going to be the focus of our efforts, particularly if we are lay people. It's going to be almost the exclusive focus of our interest, because for a lay audience, all that we're going to know and all that we're going to really care about are the practices, the discourses, the beliefs, the ideals and ideas that we find in these suttas. And these suttas are miscellaneous in various ways. They contain discourses, as I've just said, but they also contain arguments, they contain discussions, they contain legends and myths, they contain all kinds of different material, but mostly they're presented as discussions or lectures that either the Buddha gave to somebody, or discussions that various monastics had with each other or with the Buddha. They bring the material down to earth. There is a good deal of repetition in them, because they were, again, when they began, they were orally transmitted, and oral transmission really does depend upon a certain amount of repetition. It becomes easier to remember things if they're repeated with certain kinds of patterns in them. So there's a certain amount of repetition in them. Now, it's also important to say that not all of the suttas are necessarily as early as others. There's a great deal of miscellany even within the suttas. There are some suttas that appear to be quite early by most scholarly standards. There are other ones that appear to be quite late. There are some that are even expressly after the Buddha's lifetime. One of the most famous suttas, the sutta that discusses the Buddha's death, of course, would have had to have been composed after he passed away. So there's a great deal of different material in here, but it is, if we are, I think for most practicing Buddhists, particularly lay practicing Buddhists, it's the suttas that we really care about. There are also close parallels to many of these suttas in other languages. What I said at the beginning here is that the Pali Canon is the largest collection of this early material we have in an Indic language. That's because we also have very large collections of the same material in other languages. We have fragments in Sanskrit and other Indic languages, but only fragments. But we have basically a complete collection in Chinese, which is known as the Agamas. And it's by comparing and contrasting the Chinese with the Pali that we come to an understanding of what would have been what's called pre-sectarian Buddhism, because both of these lineages would have gone back to a time before they had split off into their various schools. And so if we find the same stories in the Pali and the Chinese, we know that these stories were the common heritage of all the schools at a time before they had split off into their different schools, basically. And most of the texts are indeed that way. They're preserved in both these collections and indeed in other kinds of fragmentary collections that exist elsewhere. Now, from there I want to turn to the Vinaya, the Vinaya being the second one of these baskets that we find in the Pali Canon. And the Vinaya is basically the Buddhist rule book, the rules that were given to monastics. The most famous part of this rule book is called the Patimokkha, and the Patimokkha are the specific rules that monastics have to follow in order to be monastics. I mean, what it is to be a monastic is to follow certain kinds of rules, in an organized group in this way. But the Vinaya is more than just a list of rules. It's also an enormous amount of stories, myths, legends, justifications of these rules. In other words, they don't just give you a rule, but then they want to have, there's a story about how that rule came about, which is supposed to motivate the rule. Some of these motivations are more convincing than others, but nevertheless, they're there. That is part of what the Vinaya contains, so that we're able to understand where the rules came from. Now, the rules themselves don't come from the very earliest period, because when the Buddha began to teach, he didn't have any rules like these. It is said that rules were basically produced on an ad hoc basis as needed. So the Buddha would ordain people to be disciples of his, and then over time began to be aware of the fact that these disciples were doing things that really were not skillful. And so the Buddha would lay down a certain kind of rule. And as more rules were needed, he would lay down others. That's how this rule book increased in size. Now, while the rule book itself, the Patimokkha, may be indeed original, it may go back to the Buddha himself, so far as we know. It's hard to know for sure, but that's at least some of the supposition. Much of the additional materials, such as the legends, the stories, the justifications for the rules, and so on, these seem to be somewhat later. They differ from one thing. Some material in them differs from school to an extent, although there's a great deal also of overlap. And a lot of this material, so what we want to say about the Vinaya is that it's a very complicated kind of basket of texts, very layered basket of texts, some being early, some being rather later, some being the common repository of all of the Buddhist schools, and others being somewhat sectarian and sort of, the belief of one school and not another, shall we say. The third basket, or Pitaka, is the Abhidhamma, or Abhidharma. Abhidhamma is the Pali word, but it's the same word in Sanskrit as Abhidharma. And what the Abhidhamma is essentially a large attempt to systematize or regularize the Dharma. When we want to learn about what the Buddha taught, when we want to learn about all the dharmas that the Buddha gave to us, it's very difficult to find it if we have to look into a number of suttas. They're not particularly well organized. And so there was an attempt after the Buddha's lifetime, and indeed arguably even during the Buddha's lifetime, to sort of organize everything. During the Buddha's lifetime, this seems to have been led by Sariputta, again, who was the Buddha's foremost disciple in wisdom. And we find, as I say, Sariputta leading the monastics in chanting together of numerical lists. So all of the ones, all of the twos, all of the threes, like the Four Noble Truths would be under the fours, the Eightfold Path would be under the eights, so on and so forth. And this was an early attempt to sort of organize and regularize the Dharma so that it could be remembered, so that new people could be introduced to it quickly and understand what it was all about. And while that began perhaps arguably during the Buddha's lifetime, it took on greater steam after he passed away, and there was more of an attempt to sort of organize and regularize this. However, so I should say, within the Pali Canon, there are 7 different books of the Abhidharma, or Abhidhamma, I should say, and these organized in one way or another or involve different organizational methods of getting at the Dharma and understanding it as a whole. It's important to keep in mind, however, that the Abhidharma in general, and the Abhidhamma in particular, these are largely sectarian creations. That is to say, the Abhidharma of a school is its own construction. And so it's best to see the Abhidhamma as an attempt to put forward the Theravada interpretation of the Dharma, the Theravada interpretation of what the Buddha said, of how we're supposed to interpret the suttas, rather than seeing it as something that goes back to a common heritage of all Buddhist schools. And the reason we say this is that if we look at the Abhidharma of different schools, we do not see a lot of overlap. Indeed, instead, we see are sectarian attempts to interpret the Buddha's words according to their own particular understanding, which is to say that the Abhidhamma or Abhidharmas would have been created after the time at which Buddhism split into different schools, or at least most of it might have been. There may have been indeed a core that was retained in all of the schools. This is something of a matter of discourse and discussion and controversy nowadays. But if there was a common core, it was a relatively small common core, and the rest of it in each of the Abhidharmas of the various schools was sectarian, was produced after the split in order to, again, justify and regularize and expound their own interpretation, their own understanding of how we're supposed to really grasp the Dharma. So if we look at these three baskets, the Sutta basket, the Vinaya basket, and the Abhidhamma basket, in the Abhidhamma there is the least overlap between the Theravada, the Pali Canon, the Pali Abhidhamma, and the Abhidhamma of other schools. And as a result, we may wonder whether it actually goes back to the Buddha. We don't actually believe that the Abhidharma goes back to the historical Buddha. Traditionally, it's understood to have been something that was taught by the Buddha in some way, but historically, it seems to have been something that arose well after his lifetime. And with all of what we're discussing today, one of the questions that may come up for us is how much of it really does go back to, or might potentially go back to, a historical Buddha. And I've done a playlist actually on an introduction to early Buddhism, which is just trying to answer this kind of question. What is early Buddhism? How much of it had to do with a historical Buddha, and so on. What I'll do is I'll leave a link to that playlist up on the screen here. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page and joining us over there. It means a lot to have your support and to have the support of all of my patrons over on Patreon. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video.